Okay, so I'm in Eclipse and I've created a project that I'm calling Assignment 13. And inside of this project, I'm going to create a new class and I'm going to call this Maze Generator. And I'm going to create another new class. And this class is what I'm going to refer to as kind of a container class. I'm going to call it Location. And I call it a container class because it really isn't going to have much in it. It's just going to have a public int x and y. And that's it. The class is finished. I'm not going to do anything else with it. The whole purpose of a location is to just store the coordinates, some xy coordinates, in a nice tidy little container that I can refer to as a location. So now our maze generator. It's going to do a lot of the basic framework is going to be just like the framework of several other graphical applications that we've created. It's going to extend JFrame. And of course, when you extend JFrame, you've got to import the JFrame, and we get rid of the warning for the default version ID. And I'm going to create a public, well, I'm just going to type main, hold down Control, hit spacebar, and tap Enter so that I get this main thing. And inside of main, I'm going to create a new maze generator. I'm going to call it MG, and it's going to be a new maze generator. I'm going to set its size. So I'm going to say mg.setSize. And let's see, what's a good size for a maze generator? I'm going to set it to, I'm going to set it to some width and some height. Now, I haven't defined those variables width and height. I'm going to define them up top this time. I'm going to make them public static final int width equals 550 and public static final int height equals 600. I'd like to be able to refer to them from some other part of my program as width and height, and if I ever want to change it, only have to change it in one place, so I'm going to do that. Now I'm going to do a couple of other things inside of main. One of the things that I kind of want to do, I want to say that I haven't done in the past, I'm going to say mg.setResizable to false. In the past, when we open these JFrames, a person who is running the program could click on the corner of the window and drag it to the left and right, make it bigger and smaller. And if they do that, it ought to resize nicely, but you know, that's a lot of extra work. And I feel like I'm just going to prevent them from doing that and then not have to write the code to make it do it nicely and smoothly. And then I'm going to do another thing that I haven't done in the past. I'm going to say mg.setDefaultCloseOperation. And this default close operation is going to be JFrame.ExitOnClose. We haven't done that in the past, and you know, this is kind of a good thing to do. It just makes sure that when you click that little X on the corner of the JFrame and close it, that everything in your program closes up nicely and it doesn't leave anything in the background running. And that's kind of important, because otherwise, if you got things in the background running, if they open your program a bunch of times, eventually their computer slows down. So this is kind of a useful thing to do. And then mg.setVisible. to true. All right. And so some of this we've done before. Some of it's just a couple of new things that are a little bit, make it just a little bit nicer as we go, little by little. Each time I do a program, I'm going to have the same old stuff plus a couple of other little extra pieces to try to make it a little bit nicer than the previous programs we've done. Now, if I'm going to have a maze generator, I'm going to have some data. One of the things that I'm going to want to have is I'm going to want to have, a button. And when I click on this button, it'll create the maze. So I'm going to call this button Make Maze. Now, I'd like to be able to create mazes of different sizes, real simple mazes and real complicated mazes. And I don't want to have to, rerun my program or edit my code and recompile. I like to be able to just drag a scroll bar to all the way to the right if it's a real big complicated maze, and all the way to the left if it's a little simple one. And I want to change the size in the horizontal and vertical differently. So I'm going to say private scroll bar rows. And that's going to set the number of rows in my maze. And private scroll bar calls. And that's going to set the number of columns in my maze. Now if I hover over my cursor over this, it tells me to fix the red underline. I've got to import button. And for this one, I've got to import scroll bar, and that's going to fix both of those. Now I've got some warnings that I don't use them. That's fine. I haven't used them yet. I just haven't written that bit of code yet. And right now, I'm just going to start by setting up the appearance. And then later on, I'm going to add the actual hard part, which is the code that creates the maze itself. That's a complicated little bit of code there. So I'm going to say public maze generator. This is the constructor. And a constructor is used to initialize the instance variables. So I'm going to start out by saying something like make maze, that's my button, is equal to a new button. And I need some text on that button so that when people click it, they know what to expect. I'm just going to say generate maze. And then I'm going to say make maze dot add action listener this. Now, if I'm going to add my maze generator as the action listener for this button, my maze generator needs to implement the action listener interface. Implements action listener. And so it's going to ask me to import action listener. And once I've done that, it tells me that the maze generator needs to add the unimplemented methods. And when I add the unimplemented methods, it adds this action performed. So now, when they click on this button, it's going to perform this action down here. And later on, I'll go down there and fill in that code. But for now, I just want to create the graphical interface. I just want to put my buttons and sliders on and maybe a label or something. Oh yeah, a label or something. Private label maze size label. And of course, I've got to import label. So now, let's create our scroll bars. I'm going to say rows equals new scroll bar and I've got to tell it whether it's a vertical or a horizontal scroll bar. And I'm going to make the one that controls the number of rows vertical. So I'm going to say scroll bar dot vertical. And it's going to be 20 by, oh, I guess I should tell you what these numbers are and where they're coming from. Where did I get this? Well, when I asked myself, how do I do a scroll bar, I went to Google. All the answers are in Google. So in Google, I asked the question, well, first I go to the Java API. I asked Google, where's the Java API? And all the buttons and labels and widgets and things that I've been using are in java.awt. Now, there are other ways to do that, but everything that I'm using comes out of the Java AWT package. And I was just kind of looking through here at things that I thought might be interesting, and I found scroll bar, and I thought, that's interesting. Well, how do I create a scroll bar? And it looks like this. All right, that's good. And I saw down here where it says constructors, right? Where's constructors? Constructors. And there's this one. It says orientation, int value, int visible, int minimum, int maximum. So I clicked on it, and it tells me that the parameters, orientation indicates the orientation of the scroll bar. Value, the initial value of the scroll bar. Okay, that's important to know. Visible, the visible amount of the scroll bar typically represents the size of the bubble. So if this thing is the bubble and I want it to be, maybe 10% of the total length of the scroll bar, I think maybe, I'm going to try and put 10. Or maybe it's 10 pixels to make it 10, I don't know. It doesn't really say here, but we can try different numbers for that because I know it's an int, and see what happens. Minimum, the minimum value of the scroll bar, the maximum value of the scroll bar. So when I scroll, I'm going to be able to get the value, and when it's all the way at the top, the value is going to be equal to whatever I set the minimum value. When it's all the way to the bottom, it's going to be the maximum value. And when it's somewhere in between, it'll be somewhere in between. All right. So what's the minimum number of rows? Okay, 20. What was that? What's the first parameter? Oh, orientation. It says an int orientation, but I did scroll bar vertical. Where did I get that from? Well, commonly when they have something like this, where they're asking for an int and they tell you that it's an orientation, you're like, how is an int an orientation? You can look up at the fields of the class, up near the top. And they're going to give you some stuff. And there's one field that says that, hey, this is a static int, and it's horizontal. And this one's a static int vertical. If it's static, I can get at it by typing the name of the class, dot, and then the word. And so if there's an int that describes horizontal, it would be scroll bar dot horizontal. And if there's an int that indicates vertical, it would be scroll bar dot vertical. And then let's look at that constructor again. It's right there. Okay. So value, the default value. So I'm going to say that when I first start, I'd sort of like the default maze to have about 20 columns and 20 rows. So I can set it its default to 20. And I'm just going to put a 10 for the size of the bubble. I don't know exactly what that is, but let's hope that looks good. And then 5 for the minimum value, because a maze with fewer than 5 rows or 5 columns isn't really much of a maze, is it? So then 150, because if it's got more than 150, it's going to be just an impossible maze. I'm not going to be able to have a good maze with more than rows and columns than that visible on my screen. So that should be plenty. All right, so I've got my my scroll bar that's going to tell me how many rows. I've created the scroll bar. Now I need to set its bounds. I have to control where it is on my screen. So I'm just going to say rows dot set bounds And then it's X, Y, 20 by 50. And then width, I'm going to make it 20 wide, or 10 wide, not very wide, it's just a narrow little scroll bar. And 500 high. See, my height is 600, so if I make this thing 500, it's growing almost the full height of my window, and that should be good. And these numbers here, I got by trial and error. Those aren't the numbers that I started with. But after doing this, 5 or 6 times and just kind of fiddling with the numbers, I got something that I liked. And then rows dot add adjustment listener. I'm going to leave that out for now, and I'll add it in later. So I've set my bounds. That's something that is better explained after we have the scroll bars in. Calls, going to be similar, equals new scroll bar. Scroll bar dot horizontal, and this time it's going to be 20 is my default, 10 is my bubble, 5 is my minimum, and 150 is my maximum. Hey, it's the same thing except that it's horizontal. Calls.setBounds. And this time I'm going to make it at 30 in the X, 40 in the Y, a width of 500, and a height of 10. So the width and height I've kind of flip-flopped. Okay, so if it's horizontal, it's going to be really wide and not very tall. If it's vertical, it's going to be really tall and not very wide. And these positions I just got by trial and error. And then I want to add these to my J-frame, yeah? Actually, I want to add all of these. So I'm just going to say add. Nothing's visible on the J-frame until it's been added to the J-frame. So we say add my Make Maze button. Add the rows scroll bar. Add the calls scroll bar. And let's see if we can run this. I'm hoping to have a button and 2 scroll bars. Now that does not look as good as I had hoped. I know it went wrong. So by default, every J-frame has a layout manager, and I'm not using a layout manager. I'm positioning everything with this set bounds thing. Oh, I didn't set the bounds of my button. Well, that's another problem. All right. Well, make maze dot set bounds. Let's see, my button, I'm going to put it in the upper left-hand corner, kind of 20 in the X, 10 in the Y, a width of 110. I started out with 100 and found out that wasn't quite enough room for my text, and a height of 20 because I like buttons that are about 20 pixels high. And then for my J-frame, I'm going to this dot set layout to null. And we did that in the last J-frame with buttons and things, yeah. And now when I try it, hopefully it'll work. All right, I've got a horizontal scroll bar, I got a vertical scroll bar, and I got a generate maze button. Of course, it doesn't do anything. What I'd like up here is a little label that tells me how many rows and how many columns I've got when this thing is set, yeah? So that as I drag my scroll bars to the left and right, it tells me how many rows and how many columns are going to be in my maze. So that's going to be my maze size label. How do I do that? I'm going to say maze size label equals new label, and I'm going to say rows dot get value. That's how we get the value of a scroll bar, is with the get value method, plus rows by. So this is going to be a number. It's going to say, well, in the beginning it's going to say 20, right? Because that's our default. So it's going to say 20 rows by, let's put a little space there. I think it'll look better. Plus calls dot get value plus columns. And that'll tell me how many rows and how many columns are in my maze. Maze size label. Set bounds. I've got to tell this label where to be. Where am I going to put my label? I'm going to put it 150 in the X, 10 in the Y, with a width of 400 because it's got to be wide enough for the text, then a height of 20 because I like that height of 20. It'll look about like the button. Same height as the button. Same vertical placement as the button. It's just shifted to the right of the button. And then I have to add it to the J's frame. Maze size label. There, 20 rows by 20 columns, but when I slide my slider, nothing happens. I need to have some sort of an action listener so that that action listener will be triggered whenever the slider changes, and in that action listener I want to change the text in my label. All right. Well, a slide bar, if I say rows dot add, there's an adjustment listener. So I have to add an adjustment listener. I want to say this. I want this maze generator, the J-frame, to be my adjustment listener. But it's not an adjustment listener, so I have to implement the adjustment listener interface. Implements adjustment listener. And if I'm going to implement the adjustment listener interface, I've got to import it. And if I import it, I've got to add the unimplemented methods. And so down here, adjustment value changed. So what do I want to do when they change the adjustment value of my scroll bar? Oh, and I want to add this adjustment listener to both rows and columns because I want that function to be triggered if they slide either one of the scroll bars. Well, if they slide it, I want to reset the text of the label, right? I want to say, and I'm going to copy this right here. And I want to set the text of my maze size label. So I'm going to say maze size label dot set text. And then I'm going to paste it. So this is the same text as I had up top, except that since the value is changed in the slider, it's going to have the new slider value. So now when I run this, if I slide it, oh, it didn't work. That's not good. Why not? Oh, I didn't repaint. If I don't repaint, so it's changing the label, but I can't see the change on my screen until I repaint. I have to tell my J-frame to repaint itself whenever I change something. That's still not right. What did I do wrong? I've still made a mistake. Oh no, it is changing. It's changing on the vertical one, but not the horizontal one. I messed something up. Oh, I've got rows add adjustment listener here, and I should have changed this to columns calls.add adjustment listener. It's important to test. Fix those mistakes early. Type just a little bit of code and then test it. Type a little more code and then test it, and keep testing because you'll make mistakes just like I do. This is my second time around and I'm still making mistakes. I made a lot more mistakes the first time around. All right. Great, so I slide my slider and the numbers change. That's wonderful. Still a long way from generating a maze, right? All right. What I'd like to be able to do is I'd like to have some sort of a panel here that I can draw my maze in, okay? And I want to use a sort of a paint kind of method. You remember how we did paint in our first application when we were drawing faces? I want to be able to paint in there and paint my maze. But if I try to add a paint method to this thing and I have buttons and widgets, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to do. So what I need is I need some new thing that I can add to my J-frame that I can paint inside of. That new thing is going to be a J-panel. I'm going to create a new class, and it's going to extend J-panel. Okay? So File, New, Class. I'm going to call this class Maze, because it's going to have all the maze stuff in it. The maze generator is really just an interface to hold the slide bars and the other stuff, but all the complicated maze generation code is going to be, and to draw the maze itself is going to be in this other class, just kind of splitting things up a bit. So this maze class is going to extend JPanel. And of course, if I'm going to extend JPanel, I've got to import JPanel. JPanel is like a J-frame, except that it's just a component. It's a smaller thing. And I can add a JPanel to a J-frame. Okay? So before I get too far, I'm going to create a sort of paint method. Let's see, what's the best way to do this? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give this thing its own width and height. Private int width and private int height. Okay. Now, I don't need to do that quite yet. We'll worry about that later. I may not even ever do that. I need to have something like a public void paint graphics G, where I can, like what I had in the J-frame of the previous classes, and of course we're going to import graphics, where I can use this to paint stuff. Okay? Except that for a J-panel, it's not paint, it's paint component. Okay? Now, just to make sure this is working the way that I think it is, I'm just going to add a little bit of code. I'm going to say g.setColor. Color.red. I'm going to get the size of this thing. Okay? I'm going to say dimension. Let's just do it this way. G.fill rectangle. I'm just going to say 50 comma 50 comma 100 comma 300 and see what happens. Okay. So this is just kind of a holder. I'm going to change all that later. But I just want to be able to know that I've got this J panel on my J frame and that it's being painted the way that I think it is. Okay. So that J panel is really, it's going to be a maze. So I'm going to create an instance of a maze. A maze is a J panel because it extends J panel. All right. I'm going to create a new variable up here. I'm going to say private maze. My maze. My maze equals new maze. My maze dot set bounds $30 in the X, $50 in the Y, and give it a width of 500 and a height of 500. And I know that's going to work from experimentation. And then add my maze. Is that all I need to do? Let's try it and see what happens. I'm not even sure. Errors exist. No, I don't want to keep going with errors. There's something wrong with maze. Oh, I didn't import color. Import color. All right, try it again. Haha, I got my rectangle. And see, my maze is going to be right here. This slide bar is 500 high. And this slide bar is 500 wide. And so my maze is going to be in this location right there. And that's going to be real good and pretty. I've put in a lot of magic numbers in here. It's not good practice, but it's going to work for this thing. It's just a simple little application. Let's see, what's next? I've almost got this maze generator class done. This action performed is going to be the next big thing. And then creating all the junk inside of this maze class. I think I'm going to stop this video for now and then create a separate video. All right, this video has gotten kind of long.